Hi, I'm Ollie, and in this Geography Explained video, I'm going to be going through everything you need to know about free trade and protectionism in AQA A-Level Geography. I'm going to start by giving you an introduction to international trade, before looking then at free trade and protectionism in detail, with lots of examples and detailed analysis for each, before finishing off by looking at the debate between free trade and protectionism. The notes you can see on your screen are part of an online textbook covering the global systems and global governance section of AQA A-Level Geography, which comes up in section A of paper 2, the human geography paper. And this is the fourth of 9 videos in a playlist on the Geography Explained YouTube channel, which covers this part of the specification completely. So this is the first of 4 videos out of these 9 videos that are on the international trade and access to markets section of global systems and global governance. On the Geography Explained website, you can find these notes as part of this online textbook, as well as loads of other resources to help you in your A-Level Geography, including detailed 20 marker plans that really help you as a revision resource for this topic, global systems and global governance, but also for other topics in the AQA A-Level Geography specification. Revision webinars we're going to be running this year in Easter and every Easter to help prepare you for the final exam, and a place to sign up for tutoring if that's something you'd be interested in. But without further ado, let's get into it. I'm going to start off by having a look at the parts of the specification these notes and this video covers. So this is part of, as I mentioned, of the global systems and global governance topic in AQA A-Level Geography, and particularly it's in the subtopic international trade and access to markets. This is quite a big topic that looks at international trade overall, the role of transnational corporations, kind of detailed case on world trade and at least one food commodity. But this first video on this subtopic is really going to look at these 3 key concepts: international trade overall, free trade, and protectionism. In terms of some key potential 20 marker questions you get asked on the topic in the exam. So these 20 marker questions you can see on your screen cover the whole of the international trade and access to markets subtopic, and you can actually find detailed 20 marker plans for all of these questions, which are a brilliant revision resource on the Geography Explained website. But in terms of these ones in bold, which kind of really specifically relate to free trade and protectionism, though free trade and protectionism is going to be useful to answering all of these, but you get questions like assess the contrasting impacts of free trade and protectionism on economic development, and trading agreements are effective in reducing global inequality. Critically assess the extent to which you agree with this statement. So to what extent do free trade and protectionism support economic development, and which one is more effective at doing so, and really looking at how free trade and maybe trading agreements as a particular part of that have an impact on global inequality, linking into that global systems topic. As well, you can of course get lots of other types of questions, including 4 markers and 6 marker stimulus questions on this topic, and there's some examples here that relate to the international trade and access to markets topic overall. So there hasn't been a specific 20 marker, 6 marker or 4 marker question just on free trade or protection, and that could absolutely come up, but more generally this topic is really important to answering any question that comes up on the international trade and access to markets part of the specification. So let's start off then by having a look, by giving you an introduction to international trade. And international trade can be defined as the exchange of capital, goods and services across international borders. An individual country's exports are outbound to other countries, things it sells to other countries, and imports are inbound from other countries, so things it buys goods and services from other countries. And over the past 30 years, international trade has expanded dramatically across the world. And what that means is effectively countries are trading, selling and buying with each other a lot more than they used to. And this has been really key to the process of globalization overall, driven by improvements such as in transport and technology, the rise of transnational corporations, which we'll look at in way more detail in a future video, and trade agreements which promote free trade. So just to put some numbers on this, between 1995 and 2025, there's been a more than 5x increase in the volume of international trade, from $6.2 trillion in 1995 to more than $33 trillion in 2024, and that's continued growing in 2025, and I'm sure it will in 2026 and going forward as well. This reflects the fact that countries are increasingly interdependent and interconnected. They don't just make everything within their own country to sustain themselves, whether that's food, whether that's manufactured goods, whether that's services such as social media channels. By contrast, they effectively make what they're best at, they produce what they're most effective at and sell that to other countries, and a lot of what they need to live and sustain themselves they buy from other countries, whether that's food, a lot of food is brought from abroad, energy, oil for example, but also a wide range of goods and services. A lot of what you buy in the supermarket or in any shops wasn't produced in the United Kingdom, it was produced in other countries, and that reflects international trade. So when we go through the next two subsections looking at free trade and protectionism, make sure to focus both on memorizing examples, so of countries' experiences of international trade, free trade agreements and protectionist measures, for example, and on being able to explain the principles and processes of free trade and protectionism. You need to know what both of those are really clearly going into the exam. And this will enable you to answer specific 20 markers on this topic that we looked at, those ones in bold on free trade and protectionism, but also understanding international trade, free trade and protectionism is really important to answering any question on international trade and access to markets, but also globalization overall. So moving on to looking now at free trade. So free trade refers to the exchange of goods and services across borders with little or no restrictions. That's the free part. It's very easy to trade between countries. I can sell something to a European Union country, for example, without being charged to do so or having to fill out loads and loads of forms. So the more free trade is, the easier it is to buy from other countries and to sell to other countries. In a free trade system, producers can sell their goods wherever demand exists, so to other countries who want those goods, and consumers can buy from any supplier regardless of their nationality. And this really influences the idea of comparative advantage, which we'll have a look at. And that's the idea that countries, because they can sell anywhere and buy anything, they naturally specialize in producing and selling the goods and services that they can make most efficiently. So in the United Kingdom, financial services, the United Kingdom is very, very good at. It sells a lot of financial services to elsewhere in the world, and then it can use the money it's made from selling these services, and of course this can apply to lots of different things, to buy what they're not very good at producing. For example, the United Kingdom doesn't have much oil or natural gas, so it imports a lot of those. And this is the idea that underpins free trade. It's the idea that overall, by all countries specializing in what they're good at and selling what they're good at and buying everything else, the whole world is specializing what they're in what they're good at, and that results in an overall increase in production and much more efficient trade. So this is the idea of countries exploiting their own comparative advantage, what they're comparatively better at selling. They can produce more quality or at a lower price, and they buy things that they're less good at. And overall, the idea is that under free trade, that benefits everyone, because then if everyone gets better quality goods and services at lower prices, effectively. Closely linked to free trade is also the idea of the free market. And this is the idea that decisions about production, investment and consumptions are driven by supply and demand. So if someone in a country is producing something, they'll only do so if there's demand for it to be sold. And that means, because they're only producing something if there's demand, that we're producing things that people actually want and are actually efficient. And the kind of contrast of this is largely governments telling and deciding what to produce in demand. And the idea of the free market is that it's not government intervention. It's that production and sale of goods happens based on what's wanted and what's needed, rather than the government directing that. And therefore, the free market within economies is really key to free trade overall. A key case study we can look at of a country that's really benefited from free trade is China. It's the clearest example of how a country can benefit from free trade. After joining the World Trade Organization in 2001, the World Trade Organization's key role is to promote free trade. China opens its economy to the free market in the world and became integrated into global supply chains. And by specializing in labor-intensive manufacturing, where it had a comparative advantage because of a huge population and relatively cheap labor costs, China became the world's factory, and its exports kind of ballooned from $266 billion in 2001 to over $3.6 trillion in 2024, making it the world's largest exporter. And as a result, it made a lot of money. It drove a lot of economic growth in China and brought over 800 million people out of extreme poverty. So this is a really key argument for how free trade can be seen as effective in reducing poverty, promoting economic development and transforming a nation's economy. As I touched on briefly there, the World Trade Organization is an international organization that plays a key role in promoting free trade. It was established in 1995, in particular, promoted by the United States, and it now has 164 member countries that together represent 98% of global trade. Its core role is effectively to promote free trade, to discourage countries from placing tariffs and other trade barriers. We're going to have a look at those in a bit more detail in a minute when we look at protectionism, to ensure that trade flows as freely and smoothly and predictably as possible. It's just as easy as possible people to sell to other countries when they want to and to buy from other countries when they want to. And it does so through two key ways. First of all, it seeks to promote the negotiation of trade agreements between countries which reduce tariffs and make trade freer, and also to resolve disputes between member countries. So when there's a dispute between member countries, they might put tariffs on each other to make it more difficult to buy and sell between each other. And the World Trade Organization's dispute settlement body tries to resolve these disputes to get the tariffs brought back down and to make trade free again, effectively. And it did so in this case study of Brazil versus the United States in 2002-2009. Brazil argued that the United States was providing illegal subsidies to its cotton farmers, so effectively giving too much money to United States cotton farmers to make them give them an unfair advantage over other countries. And this effectively violated free trade and WTO agreements because it violated the free market and had too much state intervention. They took it to the WTO as a result, and the WTO ruled in favour of Brazil and confirmed that the US had violated international trade rules, so part of the WTO's international trade rules. As a result, the US agreed to pay compensation. So that's a really good example of the WTO's dispute settlement body bringing down tariffs and resolving trade disputes. The main way free trade then, so first we had a look at the World Trade Organization. Now we're going to have a look at, okay, how overall is free trade achieved in the global economy? The main way it's achieved is through trade agreements between countries. This is where countries come together and agree on a set of rules about how they'll trade with each other in terms of goods and services. And crucially, these aim to reduce tariffs, quotas, or other trade barriers. So firstly, it's through bilateral trade agreements. These are trade deals between two countries, and they often focus on lowering tariffs on specific goods that they often trade with each other, but also there's other things that come into them, such as on investment and intellectual property. A key recent example of this is between two of the world's largest economies in 2025, between the US and Japan. So in July 2025, a major bilateral deal between the world's largest and third largest economies was signed, reduced tariffs on a wide range of goods, including cars, industrial products, and agricultural goods, and also boosted cooperation between the two countries. This is it didn't reduce tariffs to zero, but it's a really good example of how these bilateral trade agreements can make trade freer between the two different countries and really promote free trade. And if trade is freer, there's going to be more buying and selling between those countries, more international trade, for example. There's also multilateral trade agreements. So as you can probably guess, these aren't just between two countries. These involve multiple countries and are often negotiated through international organizations such as the WTO. They can be harder to negotiate because there's a number of different countries who have different interests involved, but they can be really effective. The clearest example of the most significant multilateral trade agreement is the European Union. It's the most economically integrated bloc of countries in the world. It's not just a free trade area, but actually a single market where goods, services, and people can travel between borders without checks, and it represents 14% of global GDP. So effectively, European Union countries have agreed to reduce tariffs to zero on all trade to really promote free trade within the European Union between states, and that's been really effective. The EU now represent around 14% of global GDP, and the fact that there's very few trade barriers or tariffs or no tariffs between countries effectively promotes trade between countries. There are also other ones which are less directly economically integrated. Of course, the EU's also got things like the euro, a shared currency. It doesn't have to be as far as this. There are also multilateral trade agreements such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which links together 15 countries across Asia and the Pacific, including big economies like China, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, and all of the ASEAN states. There's not a unified bloc, but what it has done is an agreement that significantly reduced tariffs and harmonised trade rules. It covers around 2.3 billion people and nearly 30% of global GDP. So it's a really good example you can use of a trade agreement that's promoted free trade, effectively, because it really has promoted them free trade between those countries. And then one facilitated by the World Trade Organization was the Bali Package, a landmark success and the first comprehensive trade agreement approved by the WTO in decades in 2023. And it focused on reducing red tape and simplifying customs procedures globally. It's aimed to kind of promote free trade by cutting the amount of time associated with trade, for example, in relation to paperwork, really, and it's estimated to reduce global trade costs by 14.3% on average. So that's free trade. It's effectively key to it is the free market and comparative advantage, and it's really focused on reducing trade barriers to increase the volume and amount of trade, buying and selling between different countries. The opposite of free trade, which we're going to have a look at now, is protectionism, and this refers to the key things we've been talking about, which are the opposite of free trade. Tariffs, quotas, which free trade tries to bring down. It refers to government policies that restrict or make international trade more difficult. And that's for a number of reasons. It can be to protect or promote domestic industries, so a country's own industries from foreign competition. And instead of allowing goods to flow freely between different borders, protectionist measures raise trade barriers to make it more expensive for domestic consumers to buy foreign goods, and therefore if I'm in the UK and it's made more expensive for me to buy, for example, a computer from Japan, say, I'm more likely to buy a computer from the United Kingdom. So that's how they try and promote domestic industries. They try and convince their own consumers to buy from their own industries rather than from abroad. A number of key barriers to trade you can memorize. You don't have to memorize all of these. I'd start with the top ones, which are the most significant, and the most significant is tariffs, which are taxes placed on imported goods, making them more expensive compared to domestic products. So for example, that example I just mentioned, the UK may put a 20% tariff on computers from Japan, let's say. That makes it much more expensive for me to buy a computer from Japan, and I'm more likely to buy one from a UK-based company, for example. Whilst they can help domestic producers, they do raise prices for consumers and may provoke retaliation from other countries. Import licenses are official permission to bring required goods into a country, so governments may use them to control the quantity of imports. So they can say effectively only certain people can sell into our country, and that obviously reduces free trade because not everyone can buy and sell to consumers in a certain country. Import quotas set a kind of volume limit on the number of cars or any goods that can be sold. So for example, you could say only 250,000 cars can be imported into the UK, and that will help promote UK car companies, for example, rather than everyone buying from German car companies, for example, such as BMW. Subsidies, which we had a kind of quick reference to earlier in the video, are financial support given by governments to domestic industries. So effectively, if a government might give farmers in its country loads of money, that means that they can sell at lower prices, and they're kind of at an advantage in comparison to sellers from other countries. Sanctions can restrict trade from a particular country. These are often used for kind of political reasons, and embargoes or regulatory or trade restrictions as well. But the key ones, of course, these are all in the specification, but the key ones are really tariffs, import quotas and subsidies. And you really want to understand how they limit free trade. And the key way they limit free trade is by benefiting, trying to effectively harm other countries selling into a country so that they benefit the domestic producers. Looking then at the different strategies or reasonings behind protectionist policies, because effectively in some of your 20-mark essays, you might be asked to effectively assess the different impact of free trade and protectionism on economic development. On the one hand, it can be argued that free trade really benefits economic development. We'll look at these arguments at the end. But on the other hand, we can argue actually that sometimes protectionism can, and that's why these measures are often used by governments. So first of all, it's to protect infant or growing industries. So this is the idea that when an industry is growing within a country, it's simply not powerful yet enough to compete on the global market with foreign competition. It's particularly for low and middle income countries who maybe don't have these kind of key established industries, and it's difficult to go and compete. So what a country might do is put tariffs up. So say the United Kingdom might want to try and really produce a lot more cars again. They might put tariffs on 50% tariffs on all car imports from other countries. That makes it 50% more expensive for me to buy a German car or to buy an American car or to buy a Japanese car or a car from anywhere than to buy a British car. And that means that British consumers are more likely to buy British cars. So this is the idea that when a industry or kind of companies are growing, you can give them that demand from your own domestic economy to allow them to grow, allow them to give them more money to reinvest. And then once they're strong enough, you can drop those tariffs and start making it much more profitable for them to sell abroad effectively, because they can now compete. And a really good example of this is actually South Korea's car industry. In the 1960s and 70s, South Korea protected its car industry by imposing high tariffs on imported vehicles and offering subsidies to domestic firms such as Hyundai and Kia. And this allowed these Korean firms to develop skills, technology and capacity over time, whereas if they'd just been thrown into the market, they probably would have not been able to effectively compete with Japan, European or US car manufacturers, and South Korean consumers would have just bought these instead. By the 1990s, having been protected by these tariffs, these protectionist measures for a long time, South Korea's car industry was now competitive, and they reduced the tariffs, and they were then able to compete globally with these other countries. Another key justification for protectionism is often to try and reshore or protect jobs. So reshoring is trying to bring jobs back to a country, or protecting them is to stop them losing jobs. And effectively this is the idea that if another country is competing in an industry and it's out competing the United States because it might have cheaper labor, for example, that means that states might often, or companies, might often change their production away from the United States, for example, to go to another country where they can get cheaper labor. But governments might step in because they don't want to lose jobs from their domestic economy here. So they might use protectionist tools such as tariffs, subsidies, or tax breaks to help companies in the United States. So might give them more money. Therefore, that makes it cheaper for them to produce in the United States and reduces the incentive to go and produce instead in China, for example, or Vietnam, or China is where it often happened. And this is a key kind of part of Trump's America First agenda, where a lot of manufacturing jobs have been lost to China, particularly in industries like steel and aluminium, and he imposed tariffs on 25% on steel imports and 10% on aluminium imports, arguing that these would protect American jobs. And as a result, what this meant is that some steel companies wouldn't want to be producing in China, because then to sell to the United States, which is a big market, they would effectively consumers would have to pay 25% more, which made it more expensive. And therefore, instead, they might produce in the United States, bringing jobs back to the United States. So that's another key kind of reasoning why a government may use protectionist measures. National security is another one. Some countries simply see some industries as so important for themselves, especially in times of conflict or crisis, for example, where they don't want to have to rely on foreign food, for example. So if in a war with a lot of other countries, you don't want to be relying on food imports, for example, or energy imports, oil, for example. And therefore you might protect your domestic industry by giving them subsidies, money to help them be more competitive, or by protectionist measures, which means it's more expensive for consumers to buy food from other countries. Therefore, they're more likely to buy from your own companies, domestic companies, to protect these companies and make sure you're still constantly producing really important things for your national security and for your economy, and they don't get killed by foreign competition, for example. India is a really good example of this. It's adopted strong protectionist measures to secure food self-sufficiency and reduce reliance on imports. The government has subsidised fertilisers, provided guaranteed prices for farmers, and restricted agricultural imports and food products such as wheat and rice, because the government argues that protecting its agricultural sector is essential for national security when it's got over 1.4 billion people to feed effectively. And actually recently in a trade agreement signed only a few weeks ago in early 2026 between India and the European Union, they reduced tariffs on a huge amount of things to make free trade easier, but they didn't on agricultural imports effectively, because they saw it as really key for national security. And the other one is, the final kind of reasoning is retaliation. So often if a country is annoyed at another country for whatever reason, they might have kind of economic reasons or political reasons, a country might put tariffs on another country to harm on goods, so tariffs on imports from that country to harm them, because they'll effectively make it more expensive for consumers in their country to buy from the other country, and therefore it will damage the businesses in the other countries who are trying to sell in to that country. And as a result, then the country that's being damaged might retaliate and put tariffs on the other country as well. And we saw that in 2025 when the Trump administration in America imposed 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Canada then responded immediately with retaliatory tariffs of 25% on a wide range of US goods. And this is effectively how it often happens in terms of trade wars. They keep putting tariffs on each other, and that really undermines free trade effectively. And then finally, they can actually be used, also for political leverage or punishment. So if a country wants to damage another country for political reasons, they can place tariffs on them to try and effectively damage their economy. So the US for a long time, for example, has placed sanctions and tariffs on the Iranian economy, not for economic reasons, but because they know it's going to damage the Iranian economy, and they want to put pressure on the Iranian economy and the Iranian government to stop funding their nuclear weapons program, effectively. So that's where it's going to be for political reasons. So a range of different reasons why states can use tariffs, some of them for like political national security reasons, but others really for economic reasons. That's where you can make the argument that actually free trade doesn't necessarily support economic growth. Sometimes protectionism can. And that's what we're going to finish off here by looking at the debate between protectionism and free trade. And you want to, as you go through these, think about which of the below arguments you might use in a 20 mark on free trade and protectionism, as well as which examples and specific detail you might use from the above notes to support them. So you could, as we looked at the start, get a question such as assess the contrasting impacts of free trade and protectionism on economic development. And in that, you might be using some of these arguments, comparing against each other. So on the one hand, free trade promotes economic development. On the other hand, protectionism does. And you want to use some of these arguments we're going to go through, and then also be able to bring in some of the examples we've gone through to support those in your 20 marker, for example. So there's a range of different arguments you can use. The first one, it can be argued that free trade is effective in promoting global economic growth by allowing countries to specialise in the goods and services they can produce most efficiently, following the principle of comparative advantage. And it can be argued that this promotes economic development for everyone, as everyone across the world is specialising in what they're most effective at producing at the lowest costs and the highest quality. And that really effectively promotes global economic growth for everyone, including high-income countries, low-income countries, and middle-income countries who can all specialise in what they're most effective at. And that protectionism actually disrupts this through tariffs and disrupts global economic growth, for example. But critics argue that while free trade may create growth, it can also devastate domestic industries in low-income countries that are unable to compete with stronger foreign rivals in the free market. Protectionism gives industries the breathing space they need to survive. That example from South Korea, for example, stabilise and grow, and that actually free trade overall across the global economy just hurts low-income countries, because they've got to then try and compete with businesses from high-income countries who are a lot more established and a lot richer and a lot more powerful, and therefore they just fail, and the domestic industries are killed, for example, and that prevents them from growing economically and maintains global inequality as a result. Another key argument for free trade is the argument that it provides low-income countries and middle-income countries with key opportunities for economic development, including through attracting foreign direct investment from transnational corporations. Again, we're going to look at that in loads more detail in the next few videos. And that states can industrialize rapidly, create jobs, and benefit from modern technology. And China is a really key example of a country that really has very rapidly benefited from free trade and the free market and become very powerful. But critics, on the other hand, argue that actually, no, for most low-income countries, this isn't possible. It's very difficult for them to do what China's done and develop really quickly economically. And actually, for China, there was a fair amount of state intervention that came into that as well, and a fair amount of protectionism. And actually, what it means is that the free market means that low-income countries just can't compete with middle-income and high-income countries, and therefore they maintain having to rely on the export of raw materials, which aren't very profitable, and they therefore maintain their low position in the global economy and continue to be exploited by high-income countries. And that protectionism actually is more effective at promoting economic development by protecting their domestic industries, allowing them to develop, and therefore in the long run allowing demand to actually diversify away from raw materials and develop other parts of the economy and other industries that can really compete, and they can sell stuff in, and they can therefore become richer effectively. Another key argument for free trade is it leads to lower prices for consumers. So by removing tariffs and other trade barriers, it allows goods to be produced where they're cheapest, and consumers can just buy whatever's cheapest and highest quality from anywhere. So it really increases that consumer choice for high-income countries, for consumers, particularly in high-income countries and middle-income countries. But critics, for example, someone like Donald Trump, would disagree and argue that actually free trade undermines domestic industries as well and really harms high-income countries, because production's often shifted overseas to countries where wages are cheaper, where labour costs are cheaper, and that really damages high-income countries. You could see that, for example, in the Rust Belt in the United States or Northern England, where they used to have really strong manufacturing industries, but they're now much weaker due to free trade, because a lot of companies realised, okay, because they can move to other countries, their production to other countries, but still sell back into the UK, they can reduce their production costs because they only have to pay a worker in China, for example, a third of the cost of what they'd pay a worker in the United Kingdom or the United States. And then finally, it can be argued, supporters of free trade would argue that free trade also supports cooperation and peace because it increases interdependence. We'll look at that in more detail in a future video, a couple actually on global systems on the channel, and also one on access to markets effectively. Free trade effectively strengthens global cooperation by making countries economically interdependent. They need other countries because they need to buy stuff from other countries they can't produce themselves, and that maintains, that ensures global peace. As if you're dependent on another country for their imports, you're much less likely to go to war with them, for example. But on the other hand, supporters of protectionism would argue that actually protectionism is really key, as we looked at, for maintaining national security and protecting a country, and that actually if you have complete free trade, there are key parts of your economy like free food production, for example, or energy imports that you need to be able to produce yourselves that are really key, that you're reliant on other countries for, and that's therefore really bad for national security. So we finished off there with some key arguments for free trade and the contrasting arguments for protectionism, both in terms of stuff like national security, but crucially for economic development as well. So make sure that you know what free trade and protectionism are really well, some key arguments and examples for each side, as these can be really useful for lots of potential questions you could get asked on this topic in paper 2 of the AQA A-level geography specification, which really focuses on human geography and this part of the global systems and global governance topic in particular. So as I mentioned, loads more videos coming on the Geography Explained YouTube channel on this topic. Make sure to check out our full playlist that covers all of them, and let me know if you've got any questions in the comment section below, and I'll get back to you, and we'll see you in the next video.